So in our last video, we ended right before the Second Crusade. In the First Crusade video, we talked about the origins of the Crusade. And then the second one, we talked about the First Crusade. And in this video, we begin with the Second Crusade. Well, first of all, scholars have named these events as the First or Second Crusade. They did not call them that at the time, just so you understand. And I talked a little bit about the origin of the term crusade in the last video. It actually comes from the French term croisade, and the Latin in the 12th century was one signed by the cross. And remember that the cross, the symbol of the cross, was is what the people who took the vow to go on a crusade wore as representative of their vow and as their position as a crusader. Now, the Second Crusade really is an event that took place in response to the fall of Edessa. So I'll go back and show you the Crusader states again. Oh, sorry, I got to go back some here. Well, it's just like I do it in class, so why not? So this Crusader state fell to a Muslim force. A man named Zingi captured it and threatened to attack the rest of the Crusader states, okay, in 1144. So what we know as the Second Crusade, this event, the military reason for it was in response to that event. And it was a call for knights from the west, again, to come and defend, in this case, defend the Crusader states, all right? Now, there is one very important church official associated with the Second Crusade, and that's this guy, Bernard of Clairvaux. I'm going to talk about him a little bit in another video on famous religious figures. But Bernard of Clairvaux was a very famous monk, abbot, and preacher of the 12th century. Arguably one of the most famous monks in Christian monks in history. So he was also closely connected to the Pope at the time, this guy, Pope Eugenius III. Pope Eugenius III had actually been a monk at Clairvaux. Okay? So they knew each other. And he preached the Second Crusade for Pope Eugenius. And his reputation at the time was already very well established. So he could influence a lot of people. And so that's why he's significant. The other thing Bernard did was emphasize the salvific nature of the crusade. He certainly wanted it to be military successful, but his emphasis was on that this is God giving Christian sinners an opportunity for salvation. And he used this fascinating image that I believe was connected to the doctrine of redemption of the time. The doctrine of, forgiveness of sins by Christ's death on the cross, the Christian idea, was that God made a really bad deal for himself. That God's a very bad businessman, and that God puts himself in humanity's debt when he doesn't need to. And he even pays humanity's debt when he doesn't need to for himself. Okay? So he uses this image and says, God's given you this deal and you should take it because God's put himself purposely on the bad side of that deal. Okay? But he was very influential for the crusade. So what happened in the Second Crusade? Now what's different about the Second Crusade is it was actually led by very significant kings. In the First Crusade, most of the kings were actually at odds with the papacy at the time. But the German emperor and the king of France were both at odds with the papacy, so they weren't going to go on this crusade. In the Second Crusade, you have kings like Louis VII, who had ancestors who had gone on the First Crusade. So the crusading tradition was established. And so Louis was a great impetus or force behind calling up the arranging the army, a French army of knights, and going on a crusade. And at the time, he was married to somebody that was pretty significant in the 12th century, and her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor later will be married to Henry II of England. So, and have a number of children with Henry, and I'll mention that coming up in a second. So King Louis of France with his wife goes, and they lead an army. The Holy Roman Emperor, or what I call the German Emperor, so that stands for Holy Roman Emperor, Conrad III, also led an army of mostly German-speaking knights. Now, militarily, the Second Crusade turned out to be a pretty bad failure. They got there, a lot of their army died on the way. Louis's French army went across modern-day Turkey, and that turned out to be a bad deal for them. But they got there, and they decided to attack Damascus, which really wasn't a great idea to begin with, and they lost, essentially. They attacked Damascus for a while, and then they were driven off, and they went back. Okay? So militarily, the crusade was a failure. All right, skipping ahead. The most well-known crusader, I would say, in history is Richard the Lionheart. This is supposed to be a depiction of Richard jousting with Saladin. Notice how Saladin's portrayed in this image as a blue person, which I find fascinating, but I don't know. This is a pretty well-known image it's actually from a prayer book if you look at the prayer there. But Richard and Saladin actually never personally engaged each other in battle. Now, they fought each other as generals. They led armies against each other. But they never personally engaged each other like this. When we talk about Richard, though, we're really talking about the Third Crusade. Now, this map's interesting because the map is looking west. So west is at the top of the map. So north is this way. South is this way. So I'm going to talk about these things here in a second, but the Third Crusade began with the battle really for control of Acre. And these lines are the lines of travel of the various Christian rulers and armies coming to fight in the Third Crusade. So notice how many of them decided to use sea travel instead of land travel. Now, one army did still come this way, and we're going to talk about them in a second, okay? So, now, who was Saladin? He was an important guy. Saladin had become, in 1180, the ruler of both Egypt and Syria. Interestingly, he was a Kurd by ethnicity, but he was Muslim, and he had, through rising up in the ranks and kind of infighting within their own group to some extent, he had risen to control a very large territory. And if you look at the map, if you control Egypt and Syria, you have the kingdom of Jerusalem surrounded. Saladin made it his personal goal to win back all the territory and drive the Christians out of the Middle East. He called a jihad against them, a holy war. And from his perspective, they had, from the Muslim perspective, the Christians had invaded these territories and they were driving them out. Saladin also said he wanted to get on boats and go to where they came from, too. Okay? And Saladin is pictured as a very pious Muslim man. It's said that he had a person walking around with him all the time just reading the Quran out loud to him. So that's the way he's pictured. In 1187, Saladin is very successful. He defeats a huge Christian army at a battle called the Battle of Hattin, and he captures the city of Jerusalem, and most of the Crusader states fall. Okay? And that is why the Third Crusade happens. It's really done in response to this pretty bad disaster from the Christian perspective, from the Western Christian perspective. And so, a couple of kings respond. Well, three main kings respond. Richard the Lionheart, very significant monarch. I talk about him and Philip in other contexts too. He leads contingent from England, and as you know, if you watch my other video where I talk about Richard too, there would have been plenty of French speakers on that in that group with Richard also. Philip II Augustus of France also led an army to the Middle East, and also third, Frederick I, or Frederick Barbarossa from the Holy Roman Empire, and remember that's mostly German speakers, also led an army. Okay, so you had three rather large armies led by three fairly powerful kings. Okay, this is a picture of Saladin. And notice how he's pictured. This doesn't depict a warrior here, but a more of a religious, devout man there. This is supposed to be Richard here. You can see the three lions on his shield. Now, Frederick was quite old by this time. I'm going to guess in his late 60s. Somewhere around there. And Frederick dies on the journey. It's generally thought that he fell off his horse and drowned crossing a river. Possibly had a stroke or a heart attack or something like that. But he died on the journey. And much of the army that was with him dissipated or broke up and went home. Okay? Now, some of them did end up getting to the Holy Land, but a lot of them didn't. Philip did go to the Holy Land and fought outside the city of Acre, as I showed you. There was only a couple territories left for the Western Christian side. And Acre kind of became the center of the fight there. And he fought for about a year, I would say, and then went home. Richard wanted to stay and try to accomplish a lot more. He was able to accomplish some things that were pretty significant. One, he retook a whole line of the coast. So there was a whole area before Richard left that was retaken by the Christian side. But ultimately, he could not take the city of Jerusalem, and so he decided to make a truce with Saladin. It was a 10-year truce, so it was a cessation of fighting, not a permanent treaty. And Richard did intend on coming back to the Holy Land. Richard needed to go back home because his sometimes friend and sometimes enemy, his frenemy Philip, was back in France making problems for Richard's territory in western France. Okay, so Richard ends up leaving, and after this truce, he's not able to take the city of Jerusalem, but he makes this truce, and he does intend on coming back, but he never does because he dies in 1199, and I talk about that in another video. Saladin, interestingly, died not too long after this truce, so who knows what would have happened. This is actually where Richard he's actually buried in a monastery in France. That's Richard's wife. And this is Richard's tomb in that monastery. All right. The last part I want to talk about on the Crusades here, I did talk about Louis IX in another video, or have, and you'll see that. So I'm not going to talk about him here. But so the last part I want to talk about on this Crusade video is Innocent III. Innocent III was a pope. So he became pope in 1198, and he lived till 1216. Innocent III is one of the more significant popes in history. And he's arguably the most significant pope of the Middle Ages. He's definitely a very significant pope in relation to the Crusade movement, okay? He actually called 3 major crusades. The Fourth Crusade was just one of them. All you really need to know about the Fourth Crusade that it was a complete debacle, and the Crusade army from the west ended up attacking Constantinople instead of Egypt. But Innocent ended up revolutionizing Crusade preaching and organization, and I tell you there what he did. Crusade preaching became more formalized, so recruitment and funding of soldiers became more formalized. He expanded the piety of the Crusades, meaning anyone could participate in the prayer and devotion associated. And the last thing Innocent did was expand the use of indulgences for all Christians in European Christian society.